What is up, everybody? Welcome to Strike Force number 026. I'm here with Lonely Wolf 1980 to interview him on a variety of important topics like economics, religion, and so forth. This is kind of a new thing that I want to do, is just interview one-on-one people that I probably would typically disagree with. I might do this with like Cult of Ham, Mjolnir Man, possibly a Secular Hawk, who I've been hearing about. But for right now, we are doing a Lonely Wolf 1980. And so I got a question for you, Lonely Wolf. Do you got your pea coat on?
My peacoat gets too hot for a peacoat. Maybe in the wintertime I'll have one. But they're the new counterculture.
Yeah, I remember you saying they're the new counterculture on private messaging. Oh, actually, no, you said that in the comments section of the video intro video that I posted on my channel. Right. Yeah, they're the new counterculture against thick frame hipster cut goggles that unfortunately Seth Rogen, no BS, has kind of fallen under, as you can see by this picture. I mean, seriously, he looks like freaking Seth Rogen in that picture. That's a brilliant banner, by the way. Yes, man. What?
Who is that bloke?
That's no BS. That's no bullshit.
That's what he looks like away from the. Okay. Well.
Yeah. One ugly motherfucker.
Yeah, that's the neck beard.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I did not expect him to look like that. I thought he'd look a little bit younger than that, but instead, no. He looks like he looks like the hate child. If Dolph Lundgren and Seth Rogen were to hate fuck each other, that would be what their child would look like. Okay, I'm being cruel. So anyway, getting on with this. I'm probably only going to go on for an hour with this, which, speaking of which, I'm going to start my timer right now. But yeah, I only want to do hour-long news regarding interviewing somebody because, you know, I have a whole lot of other stuff that I like to do within the day as well, like video editing and so forth. But anyway, yeah, I just wanted to ask you a few questions. I'm not going to try and challenge you a whole lot. I mean, you watch Dave Rubin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be kind of what this is. I mean, I guess I'll try and challenge my interviewees a little more than him, but I will not. I'm just going to ask you questions just for the most part, more than actually debate you. But yeah, there's something that I was curious about. I mean, I recall you saying it like I think it was in the Incredible Aspie's second 300 subscriber celebratory stream, where you basically said that you were for Marxism in the area of art.
Yeah, it's one of those things. So I guess it takes a bit of elaboration to kind of explain that. Basically, I just think that the artworks themselves are definitely sort of, those are, you know, intellectual property of the artist, etc. But I think our knowledge and our education of those pieces, and I guess the public consciousness, is something that should be shared amongst the public and should be spread available amongst the public. And unfortunately, you know, a lot of the artworks and a lot of the discourse around art, it's centered around this really elite type of thing. So you see these museums that sort of display this really substandard art that has very little meaning to the rest of the population. It's just absolute garbage. But because these, you know, fuckers who sit at the top of the pyramid, they're sitting there, you know, talking in this absolute bullshit sort of language that's impenetrable to the actual public. And
you mean pieces of art like just random splashes on a piece of paper?
Yeah, absolute rubbish. And then there's,
oh yeah,
what else is there? Like there's you know, knitting, like a woman knitting out of her vagina or something like that. So I'm gonna make you spit your drink out. And like plop egg art, and you see that it seems to have a large profile, like it's being displayed in it's being funded and everything like that. And the people who talk about and appreciate this art, like, I doubt they even know what they're talking about. They're just putting together this fancy sort of word salad, and in that way, it just puts the arts into this very elite type of position. And I think it's important to like when it comes to education, I think it's important to bring back, a full education of the history of art, so that people can have the language, so that they can appreciate the good type of art. And then I guess bringing back we've got to stop that sneering attitude towards high art and low art, because sometimes there's not really that much difference between popular culture and the so-called classical arts, because they do have a lot of things in common. So I think sometimes we can talk about popular culture using artistic things. I mean, that's what when I did a hangout with Random Geek, when we discussed the Star Wars trilogy, we were using a lot of artistic principles to talk about something that belongs into popular culture.
Now, I got to ask you a question. I'm getting out a piece of paper here for questions I might have within what you're saying. You said it's being funded. Like, what do you mean by that? Do you mean government funded? This crappier art?
I think it's a lot of museums that seem to really invest or to showcase some stuff that is really mediocre, where there's some underground artists that are producing genuinely good work that I think the general public seem to find very palatable, understandable. But I think that's what makes the art so elite, when they concentrate their energies on stuff that's to us just makes absolutely no sense and has no kind of aesthetic quality whatsoever. And they use that language to try and, I guess, that jargon language, that postmodern type language, to try and, I guess, it kind of closes out the general public from that discussion on art. And
now, let's define art here a little bit. Like, when you say art, are you meaning like paintings and drawings and whatnot, or you mean stuff like those things I just mentioned, plus music and movies? Because a whole lot of other things could be defined as art as well.
I very much agree with that. So that's why I think that like, not only do I think that the classic art, so when you think of painting and drawing or whatever, those kind of classical mediums, like, I think we should be educating ourselves on those things to understand what Cubism is, what Impressionism is, etc. So I think probably my biggest influence is Camille Paglia, like her book Sexual Persona, as well as her other books on art and poetry. They provide a good framework, so kind of a 101 book. So what I'm really advocating for is a 101 introduction to art, and to have a lot of people who are in the professions, as professors or whatever, to be able to write general books for the whole audience, rather than for this kind of little that elite part of that. And that's what I think the job of educators as well, and professors, is to generally reach out to the everyday public with some of their literature, and especially in art. I think it's an important thing.
Now, here's the thing that I feel about it, because I did a response video to Owen McDonald when he was talking about video games. And one of the points that I had mentioned in my response video, I mentioned to S-Man Speaks as well, is that I think that luxuries like video games, or even art, because really, who needs art in order to survive? And the way that I think about it is that luxuries like art and video games is a really weak wedge to try and push for the agenda of socialism. And you say that you're for Marxism in the area of art. Or you mean like
it's kind of, I think it's an analogy, really. It's not so much, I'm not using strictly like Marxism or socialism. It's kind of like, I guess when I say Marxism, I guess, because that could be misleading as well. I think what I'm specifically,
because when you at first said you're
more of an analogy, right? It's more of an analogy rather than pushing for a political angle in that particular field. So that was probably a poor wording on my part to say. I think greater public consciousness is probably what I'm pushing for, rather than saying, Marxist approach towards.
Okay, yeah, that's what kind of it kind of confused me a little bit in that original stream. What was I thought you was like advocating for an economic system where people don't own their own art and can promote their own art as they please, as long as they have the money to be able to fund for their own advertising of their own said art.
Yeah, that's probably why it was very misleading. I just think so basically just a greater public awareness to be spread, and not to and I guess it's the bridging of high art with low art, because as you said, art becomes in many different forms. So I think that's really what I try to do that with my channel somewhat. So if I try to introduce something that's classical, like I did a video on poetry where I used a very classic poem that's kind of complex, but then I try to link that to a modern song that has a very similar meaning to it. So just to show that there might not be that much of a difference between popular culture and what we consider, classical literature and art.
I see. So I want to kind of query you on some of your other like official economic stances because originally I was opening up at the whole art thing because I thought that was going to be an economic issue, but yeah, I want to like get your opinion regarding capitalism versus socialism. I brought up the label of quasi-capitalist, and I'm pretty sure that I'm not the one who invented that term, but I brought it up, and you said that that would probably be the correct label for you because just labeling you as merely capitalist, just plain capitalist, wasn't a correct way to define you and
Yeah.
your economic stance, right?
Yeah.
Bell, shut up.
So yeah, I'm not sure. I don't really understand the current discourse on the Twitter. It seems to be this all or nothing type thing. It seems to be painted as some sort of binary. So you're either with us or against us. So you're either a capitalist or a communist, and then people are going to have assertions based on that. Whereas the impression that I had, which I've always had, is that it's very much a gradient or a spectrum where we have it's the purely market driven economy on one extreme, and then on the other extreme it's a purely planned economy with area between. Like I may lean like more towards the left in certain ways when it comes to the mixed economy, but there's probably a number of reasons why I'm a little bit skeptical. Like I've given a fair treatment to the people who advocate for socialism, which is fine, but I guess because I've lived through like a number of waves of kind of, I guess, radical kind of movements, and I've seen them firsthand. Like just the current wave, and I hate to say this, but it's like there's something that's not as authentic about the current wave. So I think in the '60s there was a lot of like radical type protests. So there was a push for, there was genuine Marxism, and there were a lot of radicals, and then funnily enough, and it's not something that people talk about that much, but in the late '90s, there was also another cultural shift that kind of represented the '60s in a lot of ways in terms of consciousness. And then obviously we've got the resurgence today, but today's version seems very distorted, and it seems to be going down a track that I don't like. So I guess like if you don't mind, I'll just talk about what it was like in the '90s, like going through like when I saw the sort of radical Marxism that I saw.
Radical Marxism. Oh,
Guess,
like there was some big socialist push or something in Australia back in the '90s.
Yeah, I think it was like worldwide, and it wasn't a huge thing that was global because we didn't really have social media, but it was kind of a cultural feeling you had in the air that was very reminiscent of the certain radicals that you saw in the '60s, pushing for certain Marxist or socialist views. But I think yeah, because 1980s comes after Lonely Wolf, so I was obviously throughout the '80s. That was my first 10 years of living, and towards the end of the '80s, I guess the culture, what it looked like, it was a very much a very yuppie kind of bourgeois type culture, and it was the social divisions were very strictly kind of enforced, like not so much economically, but even socially. Whereas I think now we seem to have a distinction between social class. So we've got people who may belong to a lower class, kind of a bohemian type people who are kind of like poets or whatever, but they still have a certain respect on the rungs of society, even if they are poor. But back in the '80s, it was like it seemed like it was either you were in the crowd or you weren't, and that came about. Even the like fashion labels were it was a stifling generation, and the early '90s as well carried on from that. I remember being in school, and it was a very stifling environment where you almost had to have the right labels. So you're either in the in group or the out group, and there was no kind of subculture to turn towards. It was either in or out. And I remember
Right.
sometimes you'd buy shoes that might be a knockoff of something else, and that's pretty much like we accept that these days. But then I remember being confronted by some other student who was in the middle of the quad in front of all these people saying, "Oh, your shoes are like that's a fake knockoff. You don't do that."
Yeah. As far as all or nothing, like I hear this generally that apparently socialist and communist was more of a derogatory, like back during the mid 20th century during 20th century during the Cold War, when it was mostly Russia versus the U.S. and like you were either a capitalist or a socialist. I think I heard somebody once say that George McGovern had a whole bunch of socialist sympathies, and that was why that a whole lot of people didn't like him. But also brought up the analogy that really he is no more of a socialist than what Obama was. And really, when people said time and time again that Barack Obama was a socialist, it kind of the term socialist kind of slowly lost its meaning, because when nowadays, ever since Owen McDonald, Jocelyn is in the chat. He said he's some loud wolf on the internet. Okay. Yeah, you hear him howl. So, anyway, as I was trying to say, I cannot remember exactly what it was. Obama and socialism. People throwing around the term a lot regarding Obama, but really nowadays, the more and more I get around on the internet, I see people like Owen McDonald and Zexisy, that's another one, and a whole bunch of other YouTubers who are like full on socialists. And really, I cannot bear myself to call Barack Obama or even Bernie Sanders socialists. I mean, more like socialist light or quasi socialists, maybe, but I cannot just label them as just socialists. Now, when I think of just the term socialist, I think of people like Owen McDonald more than, well, Barack Obama. And you said something about the whole economic stance. It seems to be an all or nothing type deal regarding capitalism versus socialism. And really, the way I see it, as far as an all or nothing type of ordeal, that would either you're all capitalist or all socialist. When I think of somebody who is like all capitalist, I think of an anarcho-capitalist. Of course, a whole bunch of leftists might get teed at me for saying that, because they're all like, oh, you cannot have capitalism without a government, and so on and so forth. But then there's all socialists, which would mean like a governmentless commune, basically. Yeah. But really, as far as that comment that you made, that there really is a mix. A good portion of us are for like a mix of some government processes, but also for free market capitalism, leaving people to their own private businesses. And then there are those who are for a little bit of capitalism, mainly on the part of luxuries like video games and shoes and shirts and all those kind of amenities, or affordable amenities, but they're for socialism in regards to Social Security, single payer health care, maybe paid for housing and education as well, and so on and so forth. Those people, when I think of those type of people, I think of people like Kyle Kulinski and Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, and so on and so forth. Yeah, what do you have to say about that?
So what what I was sort of getting at, so the type of Marxism I saw, so I guess where I left off, I think it was towards because the early 90s, I guess, so as I said before, it was a very stifling sort of period in a lot of ways in terms of conformism. And then it was also both right and left. I mean, there's also a very strong PC ideology that really emerged, and similar to today's, it's kind of like the culture wars, I guess, where there was sort of a very a political correctness thing, and that kind of corrected itself over time. And that's usually what happens. We go through the waves. But you know, the I guess Generation X and Y, I think we took examples from the previous 60s generation. It was kind of a return to some of those types of experiences, because we started rejecting a lot of that that sort of consumerism and the idea that you have to wear this, you have to wear this label and that label to be part of the crowd. And so, you know, there was a lot more counterculture that was developing and a lot more subculture. So people had more of a sense of identification. And it was part of that, like a big part of that shift was, you know, people were starting to discover thrift shops and secondhand clothing stores. And what I think the result of that was also a cultural shift as well. So it was towards, I saw a lot of 60s like retro type fashion that came back in during the late 90s. And there was a lot of different colors that were out there. And so I guess the experience of you know, rebelling against the capitalist kind of hegemonic environment at the time, it wasn't just a political stance. It was very much a cultural shift that involved. It was multifaceted. It was a turn towards, you know, it was rebelling in terms of aesthetics and fashion, decor. So but it was also, you know, a sensory experience as well, because people were turning towards, you know, Buddhist philosophy or Hinduism, and you know, not necessarily.
Wait. Did you say that it was a counterculture, like a counterculture against capitalism in the 90s?
I think it was against capitalism, but it was also against social pressures for conformity as well. So
okay, yeah. I mean, that was like the emo trend going on.
yeah, it's sort of emo was a kind of, that's a very watered down version of kind of what was happening back then, because yeah, I'll talk about emos in another way. It was kind of like a that's when we had a lot of the groups known as the stoners. I guess they were a part of that as well. So that's like a very 90s type trope that began there, the stoners. And that's based in a lot of truth, I think, from what I saw. And that's what was that was interesting about some of the radicals that emerged from that generation, because it wasn't just, you know, political activism, but it was you know, it was a move towards a lot of other. It was a philosophical move as well as a political one as well. So it was inspired a lot by Eastern philosophy, which, you know, it provides a metaphysical, I guess, a metaphysical framework that really complements the political climate as well. And so you don't necessarily have to be religion, but people may view Eastern religion as a philosophy or a metaphysical system to, and they go hand in hand quite well with the idea of, you know, materialism. And so a lot of people were embracing a lot of, you know, Eastern traditions. And so there was a spiritual dimension somewhat that came along with a lot of the radicals. And these are people who were populists. They weren't kind of the snide postmodernists that we see today that that are using this kind of this jargon language that you see in, let's say, like articles like everyday feminism or whatever. It was, you know, it was populist language. It was empathic. It was emotional, and it was appeal to the general populace with that. And you know, these were people who lived by their convictions. I mean, they would go off and form their own communes, and you know, they rejected a lot of materialism and actually went off and did their own thing, and they started their own cooperatives, or you know, went and lived on communes, etc. I mean, I didn't get caught up in that, but I certainly had a respect for the movement more so. But today's, I guess, the current emergence is a bit different.
And you say the counterculture in the 90s, some of it was against capitalism. And you kind of have a bit of a point there, because in the 80s, it seemed that there was this mass influx regarding capitalism. I mean, there was one of the biggest tax cuts, or at least income taxes, that was offered by Reagan and the Congress at the time. I mean, it went from, what was it, like a 72% to all the way down to 27% for the top rate. And everyone else in between, it was like between 19 and 27%, what they ended up with at the Reagan era. And so because of those tax cuts, people had more to spend their money on. So it was just an influx of mass capitalism. People were massively spending. It was the decade of the decade of surplus, an overabundance, I guess you could say it was. And people sort of rebelled against that. H. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, he made kind of a bad image for that view of capitalism. And I guess that is what kind of sparked the counterculture, although not enough to elect a full-on socialist. Instead, we just got Bill Clinton, for example, who isn't in the least bit a socialist. I mean, he didn't even retract Reagan's tax cuts a whole lot. He raised it to like, what, 31%, I think. I cannot remember exactly. But yeah, just want to expound on your point there a little earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm seeing today, I mean, at first I was, because obviously I take an interest in a current ideology, but there is something big missing from the current discourse that people, especially the very radical type of people on the left, well, I guess the idea of going like full socialism is considered radical compared to maybe 5 years ago, where I wouldn't imagine that we'd be having.
Let me shut off
we'd be
my
sort of having a
phone.
discussion.
We wouldn't be allowed to have a discussion. What was that?
It's something that wasn't really wouldn't really be thought of. I didn't think it would be really on it, but I think now we've got the it's cohered. But I think compared to what I've seen in the past from the more authentic kind of radicals, sort of Marxism that I saw back in the day, like I think the system they're operating is very much incomplete. I mean, there's certainly a political activism, but there seems to be a lack of a populist sort of perspective. It seems more along the lines of hectoring people or kind of lecturing or perhaps, and because it lacks that also a philosophical framework, which was that's where Eastern religion was such a big part of 60s revolutions, and I guess the cultural shift in the late 90s I was speaking about. So I think that Eastern philosophy or any type of profound system was also an integral part of that, and it's hard to separate all those things. It makes up one kind of large ideology when you think of cultural shifts as well as economic and political beliefs. And because the current ideology doesn't seem to have any sort of it's that's why it seems a little bit vacuous to me at the moment, and that's why I start getting a little bit skeptical of some of the ideologies that I'm seeing emerging at the moment.
Yep, and it all roots back to the extremism of it's all or nothing.
Yeah, I mean, because what I'm seeing is
I
that
would have to say that ideologies are becoming way more jaded nowadays. Because if you rewind the clocks in American politics back like 8 or 10 years, it would be purely just conservative versus liberal. And of course, we talked about this in the ideology stream that I hosted, where S-Man and Humane joined, and so on and so forth. But nowadays, there seems to be all these different forms of libertarianism now, all these different forms of authoritarianism, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I guess the other aspect that's kind of troubling to me when it comes to that, because even though I may lean towards that, I mean, like ideally, you kind of think of it as a utopian type fantasy, but then, in reality, I think that we have this romantic view of the world that it's a very sentimental view that we seem to think that we can remove, social hierarchies or whatever, but everything is hierarchical. You remove one hierarchy, and even more, a worse one's probably going to come take its place, because I don't think any animal, because we still are animals, we are highly evolved, but we still have an animalistic instinct, and at the end of the day, I mean, if we don't have a hierarchy, then we revert back to savages.
Yeah, and on the point of hierarchies, it kind of makes me think back on anarcho philosophies like anarcho-capitalism, for example, and even anarcho-communism. Like they want to get rid of government entirely. And really, I have a whole lot of sympathies with anarcho-capitalists. But the thing that doesn't convince me that question about anarcho-capitalism is that if they were to completely get rid of the government and the military that came along with it, there would probably be some extreme warlord overseas that will come in and take over the all the ANCAP people.
Yeah,
we're just living without an organized military to protect them.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, there was a stage where I would have thought, okay, maybe I would be more on board with the socialist type ideology if it was like a what's the word for it, libertarian socialism, where
Dallas, shut up.
So if it had been so culturally and in terms of free speech and in terms of expression, etc., that it was indeed very much libertarian, as well as being economically left, that would have been fine by me. But I don't trust that that a lot of the people that I'm seeing who are pushing for socialism will be culturally in a libertarian way. I think
like Owen MacDonald wanted people of different ideologies to be punched, like Nazis, for example.
Yeah, not even with Nazis, but it's like
yeah, not just Nazis.
They are very much. I mean, just about everyone that I know who's economically very far to the left, they also happen to be left in an authoritarian way when it comes to speech codes. So the punching of Nazis, but also
I mean, One person I'd like to bring up, for example, I mean, Cult of Ham at least doesn't seem very authoritarian socially. I mean, speech and ideologies go. He's not advocating that people should get punched just for their ideology. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, I'm kind of getting the implication that he is staunchly against that, maybe even more so than S-Man Speaks.
Yeah, so I'm sort of I mean, at the end of the day, it just presents a bad optic for the left. But even the censoring of ideas, and then it's probably going to be ending up that art and like art could end up just becoming an ideological tool rather than something that's decadent or something that's a luxury item. It could become a tool for ideology, and then obviously the policing of I guess pronoun uses and so a lot of the people who are into the very hard economically left, except for Cult of Ham, he's kind of a unique case, but with a lot of others, I mean, they do very much support the current I guess they can call it the PC ideology. I mean, yeah, it's important to be polite and to be respectful of certain pronouns or whatever, but when it goes to beyond that and it creates an overreach, that's what gets me a bit concerned.
A little bit of a difference between politeness and a person just shutting up about their political beliefs, because you can be polite and at the same time still express your political beliefs. I mean, you can even sound like the most calm gentleman ever and still be all like, hey, I want to live in a white ethno state. I mean, I do not know of how well that debate gone down between Sargon of Akkad and Richard Spencer went, but I don't know. I think I'm getting kind of the gist of it. I mean, it's yeah. I do not know what the point was I was trying to make there. But yeah, I get what you're saying. You say that you would sympathize more with the left if only the left was more outspoken, or at least the economically far left. You would sympathize with them more if they were not for all this censorship bullcrap like Antifa was, for example.
Yeah, I mean, if the overall, I guess because it comes with the philosophy. I mean, it's hard to really separate the economics with the policy, but like if they had a system that was much more profound and actually engage more in philosophy rather than because it seems to be a lot of the focus is a lot on critical theory, which is they hold it very tightly, especially the identity politics. And I'm a fan, like I'm on the record saying, as a men's rights activist or men's welfare advocate, that yes, I do think in terms of intersectionality. I mean, and just about every video I make, it comes its way in there, and it's a useful tool for social analysis. But when I say the word identity politics, that's the intersectionality going into creating a very rigid system where we've got this strict narrative of saying this is the oppressor, this is the oppressed, rather than being able to have a bit of more of a nuanced look at the individual. So we're really balancing the perspective of individuals and groups. And so the current ideology, it's placing a disproportionate amount of attention on groups rather than individuals. And, both are important, but we can't go to either extreme, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking for the past few years, or at least the past few months, that the answer is somewhere in the middle. Like, I am passionately anti-abortion, but I'm not like against. I'm not totally in. I'm not extremely in that camp to the point that I am against morning after pills, for example. And at least my legal stance, as you saw when I was discussing with Cult of Ham regarding abortion, that I am not legally against abortion before the 7-week mark. But that is kind of where I want to cap it. And as far as before 7 weeks goes, I would prefer that they didn't abort. But at the same time, my legal stance is saying I don't really see the argument against it that would really be a convincing enough argument to legally cap it at 0 weeks, But yeah, I get what you're saying. We're 30 minutes in, 32 minutes in, and I kind of wanted to like query you on your specific economic beliefs, and plus I kind of want to ask your religious opinions as well. And we're kind of going on for a little bit. I just wanted to get the labeling of quasi-capitalist, and then we went on that whole spiel. I mean, it's nice that we had of what we're speaking about right now. But still, I want to try and keep this interview on the rails. So you are not for socialism in the area of luxury like video games and comics and stuff like that, are you?
That's probably a terrible idea because I think that could lead to those mediums becoming a tool for an ideological thing rather than an artistic, authentic artistic expression.
Right.
Almost
okay,
like
so video games, keep it capitalist. Fancy clothing, keep it capitalist. Cars and transportation, would you say keep it capitalist?
I think to.
I mean, of course, you'll probably be for like a mixing of it, like public transportation, like public buses, and then there will be private car companies. But you're all in all for capitalism in that area, you would say.
I'd say yes. I mean, it's something that my opinion does shift upon, right? Because over the last year, I've had many. And I think that comes with the climate that we're in at the moment. That my opinions aren't as fixed as what they once were. They do shift quite a bit.
Right. Healthcare. How's it there in Australia? It's single payer healthcare system, right?
Yes, it's a Medicare system, and obviously any system has its faults. I mean, there's no such thing as anything that's going to be perfect, no matter which way you choose. If you go left or right, there's always going to be a flaw, but it seems to be. It seems to work for the most part.
So, and that's what kind of makes me sick about Cult of Ham's dogma about it, is that he'll be all like free markets have totally failed healthcare. Like, I do not think that, as far as the United States problems goes, I do not think that it is purely a free market thing, because, for example, there is Switzerland that still has private insurance companies, and I think they are like number 3 in the modern world as far as lowest health expenditures go.
Yeah, very much.
I mean, there's a Forbes magazine article by Avik Roy that goes talking about the Switzerland healthcare system. And really, I think that's kind of would be a nice compromise, is the Switzerland style of healthcare system. I am not for full-on single-payer healthcare where the government just like takes all the entire health insurance industry, because there are people behind those health insurers who own those buildings. It's their own private business, and I don't think that the government should relinquish that. That's from a principled position. I mean, statistically, a person can argue that single payer is the best, but principally, because I'm for private property rights, I cannot support single payer healthcare system. That's just explaining my stance right there.
Yeah, that seems sort of reasonable. I mean, it's a bit of both in Australia, and anyway, I mean, we've got the Medicare system, but then there's also the option of, having private health insurance or hospital cover as well.
Oh, so they do have private health insurance over there?
Yeah, there's an option there, but you have the safety net of having like the the taxpayer funded Medicare system.
So if a person can label that as single payer, well, then in that case, United States kind of has the same. United States kind of already has a single payer healthcare system, because there's a lot of private insurance, but there's also Medicaid and Medicare. I forget of which one is which, but one of them is for the disabled and elderly, and the other is for like the chronically poor. And but yeah, I mean, the way that I guess it comes down to the definition of single payer healthcare system, is because the way that I understand single payer healthcare system, every definition that I have read on it, it is basically where there is no private insurance at all. So because you explained to me that there are some private insurers in Australia, that doesn't seem very single payer to me.
It's that's probably it's probably misleading to think of that. Because I mean
what is the definition of single payer for you?
Yeah, I just thought it was just like a I might have gotten it completely fucked up, because I'm not versed that well on economics in some respects, in certain terminologies. I'm not really that well versed on that. But
Yeah.
You know, my impression was it was just a system. There was an option basically that, you know, you pay taxes into the system, and it's this public kind of safety net.
Right. I'm trying to like, excuse me here. I'm looking for the video that I made recently talking about this issue, where I basically read the article from EVIC where I'm talking about single payer healthcare. Where is it? Okay, here we go. While I'm searching for this, explain your stance as far as education goes, and do you think that it should be completely free for the people and paid for by taxpayer dollars,
okay.
or what?
I guess, I mean, the first big problem is like, we've got to look at the reason why we've got such obscene, or at least in America anyway, the obscene level of college debt is it's ridiculous. But the source of that is the inefficiency. It's the way in which, you know, the colleges and the education system has just wasted money on needless things. It's like, because if the universities would just confine themselves to hiring academic staff, you know, and confine themselves to education, you know, we wouldn't really be in that mess where it becomes so expensive. I mean, the you look at the growth of academic staff, which are the, you know, professors and teaching assistants and, you know, all the teaching staff, you know, the growth of those academic positions, but the growth of these bureaucratic positions, these useless committee type positions that struggle to justify their existence, that grows exponentially. So, you know, we need to cut back on all these ridiculous, you know, apparatchiks that exist, and it's a vampiric type thing that's there just to have a surveillance on the students', you know, social lives. I mean, you know, what do we have? We have like you know, diversity committees. I mean, yeah, of course you've got to have like some sort of department, but to have that many people, like to actually see that Laurier University example with that young woman who got raked over the coals. The fact that you got 3 people, you know, in that room, you've got the diversity person, you got this head of this department, you've got the professor. It just goes to show you got too many useless people, you know, too many cooks in the kitchen. And, you know, we got to get to a stage to prepare students for their adult life, and we need to remove this kind of this bourgeois protection that's being, you know, demanded. And, you know, it's up to the students to regulate their own behavior, and if they can't handle that sort of, you know, if they can't handle whatever it is, then, you know, they need to find somewhere else or stay at home, you know, or go to a child. Like, we've got to stop funding, you know, childcare facilities and get back to the business of educating. So if they confine themselves to just education, they'd cut back probably 50% of their budget, and then maybe there's more of a chance that we could have a more affordable education system.
So you would say pay for everyone's education and get the funding out of childcare, the public funding out of childcare.
Oh no, like when I'm talking about it's the analogy of like university becoming a childcare center for you know, a lot of very entitled students who think that it's you know, treat them like adults, and, you know, it's up to them to regulate their own behavior and to deal with things. If there's a crime committed, of course there should be security guards. So, you know, instead of going to a grievance committee of all these chair people or whatever, it's, you know, if there's something that's, you know, a hate crime is committed or some sort of infraction, then it would be cheaper to hire security guards around the campus to deal with things as they happen, any kind of situation involving danger. But as for the rest of it, a lot of it needs to be cut back. You know, the number of useless kind of bureaucratic positions, it's just a vampiric thing on the whole system, and, you know, people could afford that. Now, as for free education, what I'd say, this is kind of conservative, what I'm saying here. Okay, so this is how I shift, but, you know, what I'm imagining is that it would depend on what your major is. So if it's a particular area in which, you know, your degree has a utility to society, so for example, you could be trained to become a doctor and there's a shortage of doctors, then that could be, then yes, you know, that would be great. But if it's kind of a degree,
you want those high skills to be paid for, like doctors and welders and so forth.
Yeah. So if there is like an idea of, like, you know, subsidized college or free college for people, then, you know, I think the first step would be targeting. It doesn't necessarily mean that every single type of major is catered for. So, you know, you could be doing like basket weaving or yoga therapy or something like that as your major. So, you know, if you can't justify that, you know, once you leave university that you can provide a utility to society, with what you're studying that that you can give back to what is, because it's an investment in, I guess, your capital, your human capital, I guess.
What about
So,
a college? What about a college history or Oh, what was the other? Oh, what about a college history or college philosophy class? Would those be paid for under your ideal system?
that's a bit questionable. It would usually it's like the areas where there are labor shortages. So it could be teaching. Well, so in some areas of teaching, I think there are shortages. So it could be mathematics, being a math teacher or something like that. At least in Australia, that's where there's a bit of a shortage. Or if it's sort of petroleum engineering or anything where there's a labor shortage, where because I think you're making an investment into a student and they have to be able to I guess in terms of service, in terms of duty, they need to be able to justify that they can pay back that in terms of their service to the community, that they can pay that back off. When it comes to like history, I don't really know what the like history or philosophy. I mean,
Right.
sure.
I mean, there's no. I don't think that there is any really workforce practicality regarding becoming a high in philosophy or history, but
Yeah.
as opposed to welding and being a doctor, as we just mentioned. But I still find history and mainly history and even philosophy to be a little bit more practical than gender studies.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some degrees where it might be just like, if you want to study this particular the fields that it's not, I have no disrespect towards those fields, but if it's not if you're not going any further than graduating and working in a cafe or writing for some rag kind of some shitty magazine, some fourth rate magazine, then like, I'm sorry, but for now it's like the priority is towards the students who are working towards a degree in which they can pay back to the into the system themselves.
Okay. I see what you're saying.
But those particular subjects, mate. I mean, I think I have a lot of respect for those subjects, and I think like I love the idea of having a sort of, I guess, a general education, because people will do their studies, they do their majors or whatever, but I think there's a lot of value in having a general education. At least maybe it could be 2 or 3 units where you dedicate to general education. So it could be, a survey history course, or it could be a survey philosophy. I mean, I think that no matter what you do, there should be probably a philosophy element to at least get you thinking. I mean, I know that even though I majored in math, that's why I made a philosophy of numbers kind of series on my own channel, just to show there's a direct link between the two areas.
Okay, so here's the definition that I found on the internet regarding single-payer healthcare. Rewinding back to that subject a bit, the United States is the only country in the developed world that does not guarantee access to basic healthcare for residents. Countries that guarantee healthcare as a human right do so through a single-payer system, which replaces the thousands of for-profit health insurance companies with a public universal plan. So it does not explicitly say that there are absolutely no private insurers, but that's kind of what that's kind of the implication that I get within that paragraph. This isn't an actual dictionary that I'm reading. It's a website called healthcarenow.org. So basically the single payer advocates defining what single payer healthcare means to them. But the implication that I'm getting is that they're replacing the for-profit health insurance companies with a public universal plan, and that's what gives me the implication that there's no private insurers.
So it's more like a dual system.
A dual system?
I guess that's what you could call it. I mean, I'm not really sure what to think about the implications of having a full, that everything is going to be like the single payer itself. That's like, because it's something you really have to think about, and to be very pragmatic about that as well, to think about the full kind of implications or and the benefits or the costs of it.
All right. There was another one that I kind of wanted to ask. Oh, we got about 13 minutes left. I might extend the time a little bit more, but What do you think about a carbon tax?
I think.
I mean, you do believe that climate change is man-made, and well, okay. Let me ask you, what do you think the extent is regarding climate change? I mean, if we weren't to do something within the next 10 years, is the Earth going to be destroyed and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the environmental problems, they're going to be interlinked. So, like whatever, like when we start sort of looking for better energy alternatives and things like that, because they're not, because global warming is not necessarily an isolated thing, because then the pollution has a number of other offsets. So it's like the runoffs into rivers or whatever. So that's why we need a lot of sort of regulations to protect anything. So a lot of the problems are interlinked. Even if you were to think, well, global warming is just a myth, it's going to happen anyway. There's still the other environmental problems that are very much real. That the solution to global warming, it's even if you don't think global warming is a thing, those solutions have a net benefit to other as well. But yeah, I tend to think that
I don't think that it's necessarily not a thing. I mean, I'm more or less on the fence, but I'm more of the potholer 54 narrative regarding climate change. I'm not of the Steven Crowder or Bill Nye, the fear mongering guy on climate change, or Al Gore. I'm not of any of those narratives, but
I mean, Al
potholer
Gore
is
is very
sorry.
popular. Um, I kind of do admire Al Gore because that's what's missing from the left. He was a counterculture, in a lot of different ways. I mean, it was in the days of Bush, and that's I don't like how the tables are turned, where people are perceiving the right side of politics as being a counterculture. Is that's what makes me uncomfortable. But unfortunately, as the left has become, authoritarian in some ways, unfortunately, people are going to perceive that. Even though I disagree, but I can see that people do feel that way. But I remember Al Gore. It's very much
Sorry, go on.
very much a populist, and he seemed very kind of embodied the spirit of kind of counterculture. But yeah, I'm kind of on that.
Yeah, even
that
you're on the what?
yeah, it's hard to know where to stand on it. I mean, in terms of climate change, I mean, yeah, there's probably are things that are natural, inevitable, but then there's obviously also a human aspect to that as well.
Right. I mean, have you watched any of Pothole 54's videos?
No, I've only watched Al Gore.
Hmm.
Not that I fully agree with him, but
Potholer kind of has a problem with Al Gore as well. I mean, he even said in one of his videos that Al Gore is doing a massive disservice with his over exaggerations on climate change.
Yeah, but he's got a lot of emphasis. He's a bit of a populist, though.
Right.
Even, I mean, no matter what the, I mean,
So back on the original question, because we're kind of
yeah.
lengthening out this interview, but carbon tax, for it or against it, and to what extent?
I'd say for it. It's a hard position to really justify. It's obviously
Hard position to justify.
yeah. In no matter what stance you take, I'd probably say yes for carbon tax. So, um, trying to think of
But
how to.
you don't know what the justification would be for it
I
to
do know,
push
but
the population.
I'm struggling to articulate the actual reason, but I'm definitely well, that it has. I think it has been tried in Australia, but I think it was a bit for political reasons. It was a big clusterfuck that with the Labor government at the time.
To what extent would you say carbon tax? Would you say for just businesses, or would you say businesses and the average citizen running their car, or would you say businesses, the average citizen running their car, and for every breath a person takes? I mean, I'm trying to ask to what extent you
Yeah.
for carbon tax.
because that's a tricky thing to do, because when you say because we've got to be careful of like the double charging, because when it comes to the top tier, so you could say, you know, the businesses, okay, but then those businesses are also consumers as well, so it's almost like they're getting double punched. So I think obviously there's certain subsidies that could be made for individuals, kind of like tax, kind of similar to the way of tax deductions in some respects when it comes to carbon tax. So if you're using your vehicle to run a business or whatever, that could be considered a business tax rather than a personal, because you don't want the government double dipping into your pockets, especially if you're a small business owner.
Okay, so for big businesses that have these hundreds of factories, you would say that you're for carbon tax in that area?
Yes, probably a heavier tax for them. So as long as it's a progressive tax rather than a regressive tax, that would be fine. So as because there's some taxes, I understand that GST is it's one of those things in Australia. It was implemented for a reason. It's not too bad of a thing, but like the essence of it is very much a regressive tax, or it's considered regressive.
But you don't think that everybody should be taxed for every breath they take and every fart they that they
No.
let out.
Like, yeah, that's getting a bit stupid. It's like the
Okay.
like water restrictions and everything, like writing a letter to the council if you want like a glass of water.
I see. Yeah, I mean that definitely goes too far in my book. I mean, I'm against the carbon tax because, again, this kind of roots back to private property rights, my private property rights stance, and plus I'm just for as low a tax as possible because I'm for letting people keep as much of their money as well possible. But yeah. I guess we'll move on to religion very quickly. I mean, we got 6 minutes left, but we'll probably extend this interview a little bit more. You say that you are like kind of religious. Like, to what extent are you religious or have a faith?
I think the important factor is I think it's a benefit for people who are born into secular families. It's often an advantage because people discover their own kind of I guess they discover their own type of religious beliefs. But I was christened as the Church of England, but that was just a ceremonial thing. It had nothing to do with religion. It was just something we did at the time. And you know, after that there was no more. I never had to go to another church again during that whole time. But then, you know, later on I might have not so much discovered God, but certainly I converted to more Catholicism than any other religion. I sort of preferred the Catholic Church over the other ones. But I just remember like going to church service. Just a friend of mine like needed company, and I thought, okay. And then there was kind of a profound, you know, spiritual experience. And when I say that I identify with the Catholic Church, it's not that I'm like I have rosary beads and everything like that, but it's not necessarily that I follow the Bible and go by the words, because I see the Bible as just very much a large metaphor. So it's a wonderful book, but I think of it as a metaphor rather than a telling of truth of everything that happens. And I don't necessarily go to church just because of the hypocrisy that I see, because I know some people, especially when you live in a small town, like when I started teaching, I lived in a very small town, and you'd see these people who go to church every week, and then they almost have this belief that it's almost like an abusive relationship where they go to church and, you know, purge their sins, and, you know, they say they're sorry and do their rosaries, Hail Mary, and then they go back to being a complete cunt for 6 days a week. So it doesn't cut it for me to see these people acting like absolute cunts for 6 days a week, and then Sunday they think, oh, okay, I'm going to go to church and purge and then start all over again. And it's just like, that is not a spiritual quest in any sense of the thing. But I think it's mainly there's aesthetic qualities that are behind the Catholic Church, and there's also a certain pagan element as well that I identify with. But I definitely wouldn't be atheist.
All right. You say that the Bible is a wonderful book or a good book. What was that? Okay.
I see it as more of a
you think that it's more I want you to like expand on that point of yours, because a whole lot of anti-theists and atheists who like disagree with you on that line. Like, why specifically do you say that the not necessarily that I would disagree with you, because you know me, I am a Christian, but at the same time, S Man Speaks calls me the most secular Christian that he has ever met, blah blah blah. And so specify what you mean by the Bible being a good book.
Well, I think that in the same way that the Iliad and the Odyssey is a book that's essential. So if you're studying Greek literature, so I think that every particular culture has a work of literature that's very that's canonical, really, when it comes to literary history. So that's the same reason you'd read the Iliad and the Odyssey, or you'd read like the works of Virgil, the Aeneas by Virgil, or the Oresteia, or major polemical pieces of work, because that's the it's kind of a foundation of, I guess, a legend type of telling of the founding of civilization. So it's like the Iliad and Odyssey. Yeah.
So you say that it's a good book and how it expands people's knowledge, just like the Iliad or whatever the heck that book was that you just say.
Just because of just because of the sweeping scope of a story that spans all these all these years and all these places, and it expands the imagination, but it's also got it's very much a metaphor for a lot of things. So
now I'd be remiss for not mentioning this, but what about the passage of Jesus dying for everyone's sins and the passages of forgiveness?
Yeah.
I mean, would you say that those are good parts of the Bible as well?
I guess it's just part. I mean, you can enjoy a whole story and admire someone's imagination for creating like a major piece of literature, but there's parts of it you might think, okay, I don't really get what the morality of that is, of kind of dying for someone's sin. I think the only metaphor I can think of is I think it's a work of I think the character traits are the ultimate sort of act of courage. So it's not very good. It doesn't say much about the rest of the human population, that they're willing to. They think that's okay for somebody to die on their behalf. But I guess for Jesus as a character, if we think of him as a character in the book, you'd probably describe him as very brave. So something that's courageous and self-sacrificing, I guess.
Necessarily that people think that it's okay that that Jesus was crucified in the painful way that he was, but people definitely respect that decision. Like it's not an immoral thing for somebody to be sacrificing themselves. And also recall in the passages of the Bible that Jesus does not put up a fight when he is arrested and when he is to be put to death.
Yeah, I mean that's that part of it's interesting as well. And it's hard
when
for me
he doesn't
to
resist.
Yeah, when he doesn't resist. I mean that's kind of an interesting part of that. It's almost like it's almost very similar to Eastern philosophy of or a Gandhi type peaceful type process.
I want to like roll back to when you were talking about your early childhood. Like you said that it was more of a ceremonial thing for you than a religious thing, right?
Yeah, it was more of a social convention that people just got baptized, but it's not that
Yeah.
anyone in the family was other than that, it was very much a secular type of family that I was brought up in.
Right. I would say that ceremonial and religious are kind of tied together because, excuse me, because the philosophy that a lot of Christians that I go talking to, my dad and other people of his caliber, they would say that they are not into religion, but they are into faith. They are not into religion because religion is all about ceremony. Ceremony and religion are tied together in that way. Like, probably the only religious part about them really is the whole being baptized thing. But stuff like, no offense, because you say that you sympathize more with Catholics, but stuff like going up to the priest to repent your sins, or taking a dab of the holy water before you walk in the church and do the cross symbol and whatnot. they don't really think that those religious ceremonial actions are necessary, but that they're more into faith in the fact that they believe and that they accept God's existence, accept Jesus as their savior. They obey the commands of Jesus and the commands of Jesus, and basically to be a moral person, not the commands of Jesus and participating in all these ceremonies and whatnot necessarily. But
it's very much it is a little bit it is a little bit pagan rather than it's more pagan than Christian in terms of
right.
I know that's probably a bit offensive to the hardcore Catholics, but there is a certain paganism that's there that's not in other religions as much.
Right. And so it seems to me that for you, well, I guess religious wouldn't be really the proper word to use for it, but it was purely religious for you, more specifically ceremonial for you, and not faith-based. Your religious view was back then.
Definitely not faith-based. Like the baptism that I went under, because the fact that we never ever went to a church as a family, like after that day, I mean, that was the last time I ever went to a church. You know, with apart from a funeral, perhaps, or a wedding or whatever. That's the last time we ever, went into a church as a family. So, in many ways, it didn't seem to make sense to be baptized when it wasn't really, when the family is very much secular rather than religious. But I think it was just a social convention it's a social ceremony rather than a religious ceremony, even though the priests might think it's or the minister might think it's a religious ceremony. The family are not considering it as a religious type thing. They're just treating it like a social, more of a social
like they
ceremony.
aren't really invested into the faith-based aspect of it. They're just going through the motions, basically.
That's exactly right. That's the only that's the extent of my religious upbringing, was just going through motions, like going to a church for a wedding.
How you stand right now, do you believe that God, as interpreted in the Bible, Jehovah, does exist, and that he sent down Yeshua, as the old translation of Jesus's name, did come down to die for our sins? Do you believe in that?
I do believe that there is a God. I'm not sure about this, like with Jesus, whether or not he was sent down just to die for sins or whatever, whether to take that the biblical verses seriously or not, whether to take them at their word. But I do believe there's a like omnipresent God. But at the same time, like I guess my spiritual beliefs, they kind of like Millennium Man, I tend to veer into astrology as well as a system to try to explain the universe as well. So it might be more of a philosophical or metaphysical quest rather than a spiritual quest. And those two things are hard to separate.
I think I recall Cult of Ham saying something in the private Twitter chat that he thinks that there is no real evidence for or against the possibility of a non-specific deistic God. But as far as specific types of gods like Zeus or Jehovah or Allah or Buddha, he doesn't believe in those ones, but he is more open to the possibility of there being a non-specific supernatural that exists out there.
Yeah, that's what I'd definitely say that.
I'm not so sure what exactly he said. In fact, he might think that I'm putting words in his mouth if I was to say that, but I'm definitely going to have to interview him as well. And I think we're going to wrap up this interview here pretty soon. What else is it that you would like to say before I end the stream, Lonely Wolf?
Not much. It's apparently I'm the loud wolf on the internet with an opinion about shit.
Yep. Jocelyn says in the chat, I'm a loud wolf on the internet, loud, lonely wolf reviews.
Yeah.
But yeah, not a whole lot of activity in the chat. I guess people weren't particularly excited of seeing this, but yeah, I think I'm going to stop it right here. And like I said, I'm going to do this plenty more times. Probably going to do one with Cult of Ham, Secular Hawk, Mjolnir Man, maybe even some random geek. I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it could be because I've spoken to him a bunch of times. He's a lovely guy.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me, Lonely Wolf.
Thank you for having me.
To all of you watching, have a good night.